and let you introduce yourself. So everybody else, please mute.
Well, good evening. Thank you for hanging around after Eldert's excellent presentation. My name's Ed Baker. I'm here to talk to you about Azure Active Directory Conditional Access, which is not an hour and a bit talk. So when Ryan told me I had over an hour, I thought, I know what I can do. I can talk about the platform protection that's built in as well. So before I move on to that, having seen the names on the list, I think most of you know me, or a lot of you know me. I'm currently an MCT, MVP in Enterprise Mobility. Spend most of my time, well, nowadays, sitting in front of screens, teaching people, but I wander around the country consulting and doing other stuff as well, and riding a motorbike most of the time. If only we could. So the agenda for my little bit tonight is I want to talk about the current threats to us. We have lots of current threats. I want to talk about the platform protection, what's built in before we even get to conditional access, and then conditional access. So it won't surprise you to know that the threats we are under at the moment are many and varied. Even today, I subscribe to something called ClearScore, which is a free service. It's actually a brilliant startup, but it's a free service that gives you access to your credit score. And in the last month, they brought up a new service, which is find out your stolen passwords. So I thought I'd have a look at that. And it brought up my, I think it was about 2004 or 2003, my MySpace password. So I logged into MySpace, changed my password and closed the account. We are all under huge threats. Passwords is obviously the main one, but there are other threats we're under as well. And once we've let people in, their dwell time in our environment can be enormous, can be hundreds of days before we know about it, especially if they're into a corporate network. Until they do something bad, we're unlikely to find them, unless we're using some of these wonderful new services, specifically things like Azure Sentinel, Conditional Access, and other intrusion protection devices. The scarier thing still is that we probably spend more than 60% of our time using a computer on the web, whether that be browsing, whether it be using OneDrive online or Word online, or just accessing other files online. The cost of a breach can be absolutely enormous, not only in finance. If you lose your data as a company, you'll open yourself up to GDPR fines, as well as a reputational hit as well. Are people going to trust you in the future if you lose their data or lose your data? Can you be trusted with their environments? Cue the poodles for Rick. Also, you will lose customers and you will lose business, and none of us can afford to do that. I'm not a particularly stats-based man, but I do like it when Microsoft produce a stat, and this is a Microsoft slide. Microsoft reckon, under this anatomy of a breach, their intelligence security machine learning document, that the average cost of a large data breach, or a data breach for a large company, can be up to 3.5, it'll say 3.6 later on in the deck, $1 million. $3.5 million for a data breach. It wouldn't cost me that because I haven't got it, but it's a potential breaker of your company to lose data. Added to that, stats like 730,000 compromised accounts in the last 4 months. That stat is from November, that's an Ignite stat. So 730,000 compromised accounts over a 4-month period. And then added to that, the stat that 67% reduction in all these compromises when MFA is enabled tells you where that risk is. That risk is your password. But we've always had a password risk. We had password risks in the good old days, the good old pre-COVID days, pre-mobility days, where we had a server, we had a nice perimeter network where we were protected, our users' devices, apps and data were all circled together, and it took more than just the slip of somebody getting in. The connection to the outside was much more protected, and you didn't need people to get in from outside so much. That's not the case anymore. We no longer have this impenetrable, hopefully impenetrable device-based security. We are now in a world where identity is everything. Identity is the control plane for all of our devices, all of our data, all of our processes, and all of our workflows. We use identity to get in and give us the privileges and permissions. And that identity requires, we need to authenticate, obviously. So authentication, single factor authentication is something you know. Your username and your password. Fine, username and password, that's no problem. It's more secure if you have something else like an authenticator app or a smart card. And it's even more secure if you add something you are. So in the case of fingerprint, facial, retina, or other identification for biometric purposes, I still miss my Lumia 950, which had fantastic retina identification. And of course it had the Windows 10 operating system, but sadly don't have that anymore. But we have the ability to secure not only our identity, not only by password, but by this extra multi-factor authentication, 2- and 3-factor authentication. And once you've authenticated, you get in and get told what you can do, and that's known as authorization. So we have authorization to use particular apps and resources, to access particular data, and then also what level of access you have with that authentication. Which leads us to having identity and access goals. Our identity and access goals, first we have to do is we need to simplify access to these devices and apps. We have this incredibly complex environment of cloud apps, cloud devices, on-premises apps and on-premises devices, and we have to give everybody access to all of them, provided they're entitled to it. So we need to make that a simple process for users, and as simple as we can for our administrators to manage, monitor, and audit. Criteria number one, or priority number one, is to safeguard our credentials. I've already stated identity is the control plane. If we don't safeguard those credentials, we're opening ourselves up to attacks at every corner. And a new one is to protect at the attempt of access, not to protect inside the environment. So if somebody breaches your security and gets in, don't start having intrusion protection and intrusion detection there. Protect at the access attempt. Stop people from getting through the final barrier. So our identity and access goals in this environment are: we want to use a single identity for on-premises and cloud resources. Well, we can do that. We don't have to have separate identities. We want to enable our customers to use their own credentials to access our resources. So if we're going to give people access to our environment and they don't work for us, we want to be able to let them use their own accounts. We don't want them to have to create a new account purely for our service. We want them to be able to reset their passwords. And we want to stop employees from using password one or Rick wears bow ties, or bad bow tie, or anyway, we don't want them to use passwords that are very easy and well known. We want to stop that. We also want to respond automatically. We want some level of machine learning and policy-based solutions to stop or to respond as soon as any form of suspicious sign-in activity is recognized, which means in the background, we therefore have to understand what means suspicious. What is suspicious sign-in? And finally, we need to analyze the sign-on risk and protect against it. Now, for the purposes of this session, I'm going to make an assumption that numbers 1 and 2 are done, and I'm going to be talking about or demonstrating section 3. I'm going to be demonstrating conditional access. But before we get to conditional access, I want to talk about some of those other things. Things like using a single identity. What are our identity platforms? And what is built into those platforms to help us secure our environments before we need to get to the conditional access level. So we have 3 tiers, if you like. Good grief, there's a plane. It's the first plane I've seen for months. Sorry, I'll divert. So Azure Active Directory. First thing to know about Azure Active Directory is we all know it isn't an Active Directory. It's an identity and access management solution. It's cloud-based, it's highly available, it's scalable, it does everything it needs to do, it's multi-tenant, and when you create your own subscription to either Intune or Office or Azure or Dynamics 365, you will get a small part of that known as a tenant, and it will normally start with your domain name and on Microsoft.com. It will always start with your domain name and on Microsoft.com. That can never be changed. Always be careful what you create it, even if you're creating it as a trial, and be even more careful what you name it, because it will live with you forever. You can add and verify as many custom domains as you want. Actually, it's 900 domains per tenant, but whether you'd ever get to that number. Built in as well are a number of critical Azure Active Directory administrative roles. Now they're built in and they give you certain permissions. You can create additional roles, both for Azure services and Azure resources and for Azure Active Directory. The Azure side of it is now built in into the portal, but the rest has to be done PowerShell and JSON scripts or JSON data. Your crown jewels on premises is enterprise admin, domain admin, anybody with access to your domain at an administrative level. In the cloud, in Azure Active Directory, it's your global administrator. Absolutely should have multi-factor authentication enabled. And you should also have a couple of these hiding that are used as break glass accounts that you don't use day to day. So should multi-factor authentication service cease to work, you at least can sign in with no restrictions and then disable MFA to let people in. It does give you issues with your CSP subscription or your CSP element of your partner portal, because you're supposed to have everybody on MFA to be able to access that. Billing administrator is a subset, as is application, authentication, and help desk. And Microsoft have created a number of services within Azure to help you with this. So there's the privileged identity management solution that will help you allocate and make these just-in-time roles, so that if anybody needs to use this role, they have to ask and they get a dedicated amount of time to use it. We want to use least privilege, give people as little privilege as they need for as short a time as they need it. So our identity services start with Active Directory, old and bold, 30 years old nearly, runs on a domain, runs on a forest. So there's the security boundary, the forest, it has domains and subdomains in it, and it needs domain controllers. It's not flat file. It has group policies. It has printers and computers and sites and services and IP addresses and all those things we're used to. It runs on LDAP, lightweight directory access protocol. It's a proper domain. Dead easy. We all know those. The Azure Active Directory solution, however, doesn't use domain controllers as we understand them. There's no replication to manage between your cloud regions. You have one service, it covers the whole of your subscriptions across all of the regions. It doesn't have organizational units. It's an entirely flat structure, although brand new and in preview are administrative units in Azure AD that do a similar job, but not exactly the same. There is the capability of putting Active Directory domain controllers in Azure as virtual machines. If you don't want to do that, you can enable the Azure Active Directory Domain Services service, which allows you to join a domain with a Windows or VM or sign in with Azure AD credentials to Windows or Linux. That's a highly available, scalable solution. It get 2 instances, and it does give you cut down versions of group policy and cut down versions of OUs, for one for computers and one for users. So there are some similarities there. But that therefore gives us the ability to link these two together. We have Active Directory and we have Azure Active Directory. We need to get our users from Active Directory into Azure Active Directory and synchronize them so that our on-premises users can use our cloud services and the on-premises services from just about anywhere. And we do that using a tool called Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect is installed on a domain member. It has a synchronization engine. It has all sorts of tools built in that help you choose what to synchronize, what OUs to synchronize, what attributes to synchronize, which users to synchronize. It's the only way you can enable Exchange Hybrid. It allows you to enable all sorts of on-premises and in the cloud authentication. By default, it will synchronize all of your users in your domain, and it will allow you to sign them in from the cloud using something called password hash sync. What it does is it multiple hashes the password of the user on premises and stores it in Azure, so that when the user goes to office.com and signs in, it redirects him to login.microsoftonline.com. It recognizes he's an on-premises user, but that there is a password hash. It checks the credential against the hash and gives him a token. It's also a great way of making sure that when you have other services enabled, like pass-through authentication we're going to see in a minute, then you can keep the hash there as a fallback in case your on-premises environment becomes unavailable. So it's non-reversible hashes. If you store your password as a hash in Azure, when credentials are leaked in the dark web, Azure will be able to understand whether your credential has been leaked, and it will help you with identity in your identity protection as well. We're going to look at smart lockout in a little while, and I'll explain identity protection as well, because it helped me understand how I'd made a major cock up while presenting or prepping for this presentation earlier in the week. It's also integrated into conditional access, which is our chosen topic in a while. This is really easy to install. It's a one install. You run it on a domain controller. It's very small. You can install, it's not standby, I've forgotten the word for it, but you can install another one, but it's not active. It will keep all the synchronizations going. When your primary one falls over, you enable the secondary one, but there can only be one active one at a time. Pass-through authentication, you can still use your password hash as well as a backup, but it installs a number of agents. You can have best practice is 3 agents on different domain members. And what that does is it allows a user that signs in from outside not on premises to go to office.com, enter his credentials. It will recognize he's not a cloud user, and it will place on a queue his credential request or his login request. The agent polls this queue on 443 outbound only, so no inbound ports are required. When he finds the request, he passes the request to the Active Directory. It's passed back, and a token is passed back through Azure Active Directory Connect for that user. In this instance, all passwords remain on premises. There's no inbound firewall rules. There's nothing stored in the perimeter or DMZ. And again, it's integrated with everything. It's agent-based. It's highly available. There's nothing complex about it, and there's zero management. You can even get it to update the agent automatically with Windows Update. The biggest benefit of this is it's entirely free. The only other way of authenticating on premises is Active Directory Federation Services, which is a significant management overhead and a very expensive solution because you need several servers all running Windows Server. Seamless single sign-on allows a user that's based on premises to sign into his on-premises device. He then signs into his on-premises device with his on-premises ID, but because single sign-on has been enabled, it then allows him to sign into all of his Office 365 and other cloud SaaS apps automatically without entering any further usernames or passwords. Again, brilliant for a domain joined device for single sign-on, no cost, and no requirement to have ADFS installed. So there's a number of ways of getting your users into Azure AD and synchronizing and authenticating both on premises and in the cloud. All of that transmission, of course, is encrypted. It's all on 443. So we've got those two identity services there. We also have the Microsoft account, the consumer account, and other third-party consumer accounts. These are useful when you want to collaborate with either customers or other businesses. So I can invite other users into my organization, share files and resources with them, and Microsoft handle all the federation requirements. I invite him, he accepts, and then signs into my Azure Active Directory with his own credentials. I don't have to manage credentials for him at all. For the B2C, it creates another directory, and it's excellent for, say I decide I want to go out and build Pokemon Ed 16 and make loads of money. I don't want those users in my directory. I want a directory for them. So I create an Azure Active Directory B2C. It then allows them to use their own identities from Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, whatever else they want to use to get in. If they have none of those, they get the option to create an account in my B2C directory, and I can then give them the permissions they need and nothing more. For all these users, I can enable self-service password change. So here you can see my domain. This is a domain, a global admin. I've enabled him to do self-service password reset, and he can do that from anywhere. If you enable password write back using Azure AD Connect, even on-premises users can do self-service password reset through the cloud. So those are the identity options and the identity methods. We now want to look at detecting the threats to all our accounts as they occur. Now, Microsoft spend $1 billion a year at their edge on cybersecurity, and you might wonder where all that goes. A large amount of it goes towards looking at all the trillions of signals that come into their network from different cloud systems and other risk events. And we'll look at some of those when we look at conditional access just in a little while. It's continuous. Microsoft applies its machine learning and artificial intelligence to derive everything it needs to know from all of these. And this is what locked me out from the Microsoft tenant yesterday. And I'll explain that as well. One of the tools that, hand up, I learned about this when I was prepping for this, is Smart Lockout. Smart Lockout is an excellent way of keeping, with the same identity, keeping bad people out and good people in. And it works like this. If I normally work in Redmond, that's a familiar location, and the AI understands that that is where I work. That is used to seeing that. So this credential from this location is a well-known login. So I log in with the correct password. My familiar location counter doesn't change. When I log in with an incorrect password, it goes up by 1. When I log in again, it goes up by 1 again. If I log in for the third time, the counter resets. If a bad actor tries it from Tasmania, where I have never been and I'm unlikely to go, that is automatically marked as an unfamiliar location, and it accesses a different counter. This counter locked out. But even with him locked out, if I log in from my local location, I don't hit that counter, I hit the familiar location, and I'm not locked out. Smart Lockout, absolutely fantastic tool, well worth using. However, we have these password challenges that we have to overcome. People using common passwords, the regular password spray attacks, and the fact that Active Directory itself can't natively ban common passwords. You need a third-party solution to manage that. So within Azure Active Directory, you can set password protection. And by default, it will work with your cloud solution, and you can set a threshold lockout to 10, lock them out for 60 seconds, and you can use both the standard password banned list and a custom list. Then, through the use of an agent, you can enable password protection on your server Active Directory as well. And you can either run it in audit or force mode to see what people are doing. So it'll allow you to stop users using silly, regular, ordinary words as passwords. They may comply with the complexity rules you have, but they may still be incredibly easy to guess. And we don't want that. More importantly, for your administrators, it's unified. It's exactly the same as you want it. So it's this simple solution for both cloud and on-premises. Passwords, however, absolute nightmare. And I wish we had got hands up actually, because if we had hands up, I'd ask for hands up on who uses passwords across multiple accounts. I think most people do. I think a lot of people that use something like LastPass probably don't, obviously, but if you're a standard password user, a lot of passwords here, 73% are duplicates. Nearly all 81% of breaches are breached through the password. Again, it's gone from 3.5 to 3.86 million here. It's from a different deck. And passwords are the #1 cost for IT departments' forgotten passwords. Simply using self-service password reset would enable that to go away. But Microsoft wants to go even further. You may have heard recently they're talking non-stop about passwordless access. Well, if you use Windows 10 and you have a TPM and you've got a camera or a biometric fingerprint device, you can use Windows Hello. You can also use it with a PIN as well, which locks away your credential and never reveals it. So you're not sending your credential anywhere, you're sending it certificated. Microsoft Authenticator for multi-factor authentication, you can enable that for passwordless. And also, if I can pull it out, these FIDO keys for enabling passwordless access on your Microsoft accounts and on your Azure Active Directory accounts. Not having a password is an excellent way of not having your password compromised. So our identity and access goals, we've been through those. Our use of a single identity for on-premises and cloud, enable our customers to use their own credentials. That's covered by B2B and B2C. Self-service password reset is a simple checkbox. Stop employees from using compromised passwords is the password protection. And we move on to analyze sign-on risk and protect appropriately and respond to our suspicious sign-on activity. And we now move into Azure Active Directory conditional access. So Azure Active Directory has a conditional access feature which is enabled if you spend money. Azure Active Directory is a free service. There are 4 tiers of Azure Active Directory now. There's free. There's then the tier you get when you buy Microsoft 365 or Office 365, and then there's Premium 1 and Premium 2. Conditional access falls into the Premium 1 category, although a fairly recent stock press. It also is included with Microsoft 365 Enterprise Solutions, E3 and E5, because it comes as part of Enterprise Mobility Suite, but it's now been included as well as part of the M365 Business Premium Solutions. You now get conditional access as well. It was the one missing link for making access secure. And what conditional access does is it takes your sign-in and it analyzes all of the signals that your sign-in presents. So where am I coming from? What is my identity? That's #1. What device am I using? Where am I coming from? And what am I trying to access? And it looks at all of those. It applies its machine learning to the 40 terabytes worth of data, which I think is per day, that it analyzes for these trillions of signals and trillions of logins every day. It applies the policies that you apply, and then it evaluates all of those policies because they're cumulative, the policies. It then applies a session risk, and based on that session risk, it can assign an effective policy from all of the policies that are created. And having come out with its effective policy, it then understands what actions it has to take through controls. Is it going to allow or block access? Is it going to give a limited access? Is it going to make me use MFA if I wasn't using it before? Have I got to change my password? Or am I going to be blocked if I'm using a legacy authentication method, so not one of the modern authentication solutions? And I can create access for SaaS apps, Microsoft Cloud apps, and on-premises and web apps as well. So I can control end-to-end access, and it all happens after the authentication has completed. It will never prevent you from authenticating, as we'll see shortly. So I mentioned where it was available. So AD Conditional Access, it's native support, obviously, it's built into Azure AD. It works on cross-platform. It's available for Windows 10, 1709 and above. And it comes as part of E3 and E5 if you buy Microsoft 365. And it comes as both part of E3 and E5 if you just buy the Enterprise Mobility Suite. To configure it, you choose your corporate resources and you make your decisions. And it's based on the device and identity signals we discussed. So we have the signal. Where are you? What are you applying for? What are you coming from? And what device are you using? Decisions made on all of your policies and then complete enforcement. So what can I control? Well, the common signals we have are user or group membership. So I've applied this to a bunch of users or a group or a device. In this instance, you can see here, this device isn't trusted. It's not compliant. Therefore, I'm not going to allow you in. IP location, you'll see when we do the demonstration, creating locations that allow you to, as an example, I know that I will never have an employee that ever goes or ever needs to access my resources from China, Russia, or North Korea. I can create a location that covers all of those and any anonymous or unknown location, and immediately block all access coming from those locations based on IP address. So as soon as they've authenticated, it will say, I'm sorry, you've got no reason to come in from those locations. I can choose users attempting to access specific apps, and that the specific app they're attempting to access will trigger a different conditional access policy than if they were trying to access another app. I also get what's known as real-time calculated risk detection. So Azure Active Directory Identity Protection will associate a risk to the sign-in and a risk to the user. And you can set the risk level that you're prepared to accept for blocking or allowing access. And the final area is Microsoft Cloud App Security, which is probably my second favorite Microsoft product. It enables you to run session control and monitor that in real time. So a user signs into a web app in a session, and it will limit his access to that depending on where he is or what he's using. The decisions you can make are very simple. You can only make two. You allow access or you block access. If you allow access, you have a number of other decisions you can make. You can say, I want one or some or all of those to be complied with. In older tenants, when you started off and went into conditional access, you would see the policies on the right-hand side. They were disabled in February. Microsoft security policies now carry out some of these, but if you enable security policies and you start using conditional access policies, then you really should go and disable your security policies in Active Directory because they will conflict. But common policies, MFA for admin roles, MFA for other users or specific management tasks in Azure. So MFA if you need to get into the portal, blocking any sign-in for anybody trying to use legacy authentication, requiring only locations that you trust for Azure multi-factor authentication registration. So when you give somebody signs in and they say you must register for MFA, they can only register for MFA if it's a location you know. If they're not in that location, they have to come away and go back and do that there. As I've already mentioned, blocking or granting access from certain locations, analyzing the risky sign-ins, which is what caught me yesterday, and use those behaviors, and then specifically require certain devices, so they must be organization managed devices, which would be managed by Intune. If it's not a managed device, you can't use it. Now, these policies are applied in two ways. They're applied, first of all, they're all evaluated. So I might have 10 conditional access policies that apply to this individual in different circumstances. Every policy is evaluated, and any access control that doesn't automatically tick as matched then needs to be looked at. In the second phase, if there are requirements you have to meet, such as MFA, change password, then you have to do those. If any of the policies block you at all, you are blocked. It's not a you can't enforce one over the other, you are completely blocked. If none of the policies block you, then you are prompted to match those other conditions. So all assignments, I can assign as many policies as I like to a user. All assignments are logically ANDed. They're all added together, and it's a situation where they all have to match, or you will end up getting blocked. So let's have a look at conditional access. We're going to have a look at named locations. We're going to have a look at creating a policy that allows access and creating a policy that blocks access. And then we're going to look at something that's quite useful called terms of use. When you enroll a device into Intune management, you can set it so the user has to accept your company's terms of use. Now, if you're using a bring your own device or you're using a web solution, you don't get that option. So you can force terms of use on a user, and if they don't accept the terms of use, they won't get access to your systems. Let's dive in. So we start off at the Azure portal. This can be done from the M365 Azure Active Directory blade, but it's effectively the same blade. So we'll dive into Azure Active Directory. Microsoft have a wonderful habit of switching things around in portals. For the last few months, everything to do with MFA and conditional access has sat in the Azure Active Directory blade under security. So we've got MFA there, and we've got conditional access here. Now, before we get to conditional access, let's have a look at the oh, timed out. That was clever, wasn't it, Edward? Let's go and do that properly again then. Let's go and have a look at the MFA provider. So this is the Azure MFA provider. I can set trusted IPs, not named location, but trusted IPs, and I can bulk enforce users to be enabled or disabled. Now, this is the heavy hammer. This means that if a user is enforced here, they must use MFA wherever they are and whatever they do. Users do not like that. I don't recommend using this tool to enforce it for anybody or anything. I recommend using conditional access. So we're going to come out of MFA and we're going to go into conditional access. I've still got these baseline policies, but again, back in February, they were removed or turned off, and security defaults can be enabled. If you do enable security defaults, then you need to not use conditional access and vice versa. So let's go in and have a look at named locations. I'm going to go and create myself a new location, and it's going to be called Argentina. And I can do it either by IP ranges. So if I know the IP ranges I want, I can do that, or I can click countries. So I can select Argentina in here. And I can also include unknown areas. So if I want to block people from getting into my system from Argentina, I can do that. I now have a non-trusted location. I also have a couple of other locations I've created. So I've got home, which gives me an IP range, and it's marked as trusted. And I've got temporary office, which funnily enough has the same IP range because I've forgot my second IP range, which I'll put in a minute. And that is a second location I can use. I also have some here of disallowed locations, and I've selected a whole bunch of locations here by regions. I can also just do IP addresses if I want to. So there's my locations. Notice trusted IPs are different to our conditional access named locations. I'm going to go into terms of use, and I'm going to create a new terms of use. So first of all, you need a PDF document that's got the terms you want people to comply with, and you create a new terms of use. Now for Rick, this is the checkbox I checked that locked me out of absolutely everything forever. So I put a new name called demo terms, and display name is terms of use. And the document I upload I've already created. Let's uploaded that. I can choose my language. I can choose a number of languages, but I'll default to English. And then I can say, this is a long document. I actually want people to read it. Well, I can't make them do that, but I can make them open it. So I'm going to make them expand it. And if you accidentally tick this box, which is require users to consent on every device, this appears, which Ed didn't read the other day. And no matter what I did, having enabled that, I was unable to get any user with this terms of use policy to be able to get into conditional access, even if it was registered in them. So I'm not ticking that. I've raised it as a fault because it won't allow me in, but I'm not selecting that. And I can also expire the contents or the consents, which means that after 3 or 6 months, they have to go and consent again. And then I can choose a custom policy to apply this with. So I'm going to go and create a custom policy. It now opens me a new policy, call it terms 1, and I can choose who must accept these terms of use. All users, users and groups. As a best practice, always put in your exclude your 2 break glass accounts. Because if you don't, and it applies to them, and one of the services that's provided doesn't work, then you end up getting a bit stuck. So I'm going to include all guests and external users, so they must comply with the terms. And I don't care what they're going into. They're going to suit all apps, all cloud apps, or I could have user actions. So when you're registering your security information, so that's your MFA registration, that's where I could say they must be in a particular location. But I'm just going to say, give you a look at what apps we can have. It shows a few of them, but I can pretty much type any app I've got. So I could choose Microsoft Planner. So if somebody wants to get into Microsoft Planner, they need to accept my terms. Conditions. This is the sign-in risk area. So what sign-in risk will this apply to? Which high doesn't apply to high because there will be another policy that doesn't let anybody in with high. So it's going to apply to low and medium and no risk. Device platforms, I can choose any or none. I'm not going to configure that. Locations, well, anybody from Argentina has to accept this terms of reference. Click done. Client apps, it's in preview, but I can force browsers, mobile apps and desktop clients and say, effectively, any app you want to connect to from Argentina, you will need to do this. And I can also use compliance as well. So I can say the device is either compliant or hybrid Azure AD joined, which would normally allow me to then exclude from a policy that blocks everybody else. I'm not going to configure compliance. Compliance is a solution that Intune uses to allow devices to enroll, and you can also use it as an audit tool. So that's that section done. I now go to the grant section. The grant section is very easy. I can grant access or deny access. So I'm going to grant access, but I'm going to require multi-factor authentication. And here I've got all my teams, my terms even. I'm going to say my demo terms must be complied with. And I'm only going to leave this on as report only. I'm not going to enable it. So I've created myself some terms and a policy that matches it. Let's go and have a look at some policies I've already got. I've created a few policies here and a few users. So I've got a user called CA test and a user called CA test 2. So I'm going to drop into this policy. This policy is active. It only picks up on me as conditional access 2 for every cloud app. I have no conditions enabled here at all, but I have access controls. So grant access and require multi-factor authentication and acceptable use policy. And I've said require all the selected controls. So when I sign in as conditional access 2, I'm going to be required to MFA and I'm going to be required to accept those policies. Now, I have here a Windows 10 client. It's signed in as a local user, but I'm going to add CA2 as an email address. And I wanted to do this to show you that it works in whatever scenario you use, not just signing into Office. It works in just about any way you want it to. Come on. So I'm going to access work or school. I'm going to connect to work or school. And I'm going to add CA test 2 at hybriddemo.cloud. What time am I due to finish, Ryan?
We started half past, so half past.
That's good. I'm on target then. That's a miracle. And it will give me my credential to sign in. It'll then go through the process of registering the device, joining Azure Active Directory. If I've got that enabled, this one just registers, I think. And once it's done that, it's then going to tell me there's something wrong with my account. And so when I go into my email accounts, it'll tell me there's something wrong with it and I need to fix it. And I need to sign in. So I go into Edge. It's a bit slow today. Normally it's done it by now. And I can sign in as the user. And immediately it knows who I am because that account is there and it says, we want MFA. So I can't gain access to anything, even though it's registered the machine, I can't gain access to anything. So I need to go to my mobile phone and I need to read my text message, 320451, and I sign in 320451, and it allows me in. And then once it's allowed me in, it then says, actually, you now have to open this acceptable use policy, read it, digest it, and accept it. And once you have done that, and only once you've done that, will you get into the system. I'm now in and I have access to all the applications I want to gain access to. The other service I can carry out is I've got another policy here, which is CA test, which is a block access completely. So this one is designed to block access. No qualms about it, just block access. It's on report only at the moment, so I'm going to enable that now. I'm going to open a browser in private, and I'm going to go to office.com. No, I'm not. I'm using that in the morning, so I'm not going to go to that one. I'll sign out of that one. Entirely different tenant. Office.com. Oh, this is wonderful. This is how many copies of Office have I got running on this machine? Right, there we are. So I can now sign in. And I can sign in as CA test. And put the password in. And it says you can't access this. It's saying you did the right thing. You've given me the right credentials. You can get in, but you haven't met the criteria for being in this system. Doesn't tell me anything else. I get some more details. So if I want to complain, I can copy that to the clipboard, send it off to my admin and say what's going on, and then he can have the embarrassing conversation that says you've been blocked. So that's my conditional access block policy. I also have a lovely tool called What If. So I can stick a user in here and say Cloud Admin, hit Cloud Admin, click Select, and I could leave the rest blank and say, what if, is there any policy for Cloud Admin? And there is. There's one called Cloud Admin All Access, and it's on report only. And then it tells me all the policies that won't apply. So if I go to the policy that will apply, I can click it, and it would tell me that if that user logged in and it wasn't set to report only, if I wanted to get to the Office 365 preview app from Excalibur locations, I would be granted access, but I have to accept these terms. So I can have what ifs as well. So last couple of minutes, we have the what if solution there. And there's a diagnosis tool as well built in. But my final last minute tip before we move into questions is if you're managing this solution or you ever get to use this solution, your top tips to keep you in the job. You have the ability with all users and all cloud apps to block access. So that blocks everybody from everything. That's not a good idea. Again, to require compliant device. If you have a user that's managing this stuff that signs in from a device that isn't compliant, he can never, ever get in. And if he has no other devices, you've effectively locked him out. Require domain join. This policy blocks or has the potential to block all users in your organization if you don't yet have a domain join device. So it might be one you want to use in future, but always have an exclusion in users from these policies. App protection policy for everybody. Again, that is an excellent policy in Intune, but if you're an administrator without a client apps application that has a policy enabled, you won't be able to use it. And finally, for all users, all cloud apps and all devices, block access effectively says, I'm going home, I don't want to play. Do not use any of those. If you use them, make sure you have an exclude for your users. And the final advice to you, your takeaway is, if you haven't ever seen it and you haven't got it, go and get a trial for either EMS E5 or Microsoft 365 E5 and sign up for that and look at Cloud App Security. No time to show it you now, but it has an enormous number of features that will help and integrates into conditional access for session controls as well. And that, as they say, is that. Any questions? Anybody? Was I on mute the whole time? That's a good question.
So I have one that's tangentially related. He said hearing himself echo. Thanks, Ed. You were talking about things like domain join and other bits and pieces throughout that. When you showed the initial sync, you were talking about single sign-on. I'm curious, how many organizations have you seen that are doing Azure AD join as opposed to AD join these days? It's something that I keep thinking maybe we should look seriously at pivoting to, but.
So my organization, so I've got, I think, 10, 15 devices in my organization. There is not one join to any domain anywhere at all. The only domains I have is the one you've just seen for my demonstrations to do synchronization. But that doesn't reflect almost 100% of organizations about who have some form of on-premises directory. So Microsoft's way of doing stuff is to say, well, obviously the cloud world and the on-premises world are merging. We have co-management. We have hybrid AD join. So you can have an AD join device and you can also Azure AD join it. And I remember when Windows 10 came out and Azure AD join became a thing, when you did it, a big box came up that said, don't join a domain. Or when you joined a domain, it said, don't join an Azure AD domain. You can only do one of them. Whereas now it's it's the state you are in for co-management, which is, there's a lot of people in a certain organization that have decided that's a permanent state, but the idea is that becomes a state to help you move from the system center world of management to the Intune world of management. And they've combined the two into Microsoft Endpoint Management to allow that merge and that movement to help. Because some people are not going to move from on-premises. They're going to keep their domains, they're going to keep their system centers, and they want that level of granular control. But with each update of Intune, you get more and more and more in the way of effectively group policy settings that make it a much closer solution. So I think in the future, it's going to be a case of they're either going to go co-management or all new devices will now be Azure AD joined. I'm just sad I left Microsoft before this took hold, really, because it'd be interesting to ask Marcus, actually. Marcus, are you Azure AD only now?
I have been for the last 3 or 4 years, I think.
Yep. And me. So as an example now, any device you take into a Microsoft building that you want to get onto the corporate network has to be managed by Intune, because that's how you get your certificate for the Wi-Fi. Otherwise, you're a guest user.
Yeah. And I'm not domain join. I'm not traditional domain join at all.
You're just Azure AD. Yeah.
Yeah.
And have you felt it's hindered you at all?
No, not at all. It's easier because I got a new machine a couple of months ago, shipped it to my home address, brand new. Do I want with it? Join.
Autopilot start?
No, just join it to the domain. Off I go. So I joined it to the Azure AD. Done. Yeah, so
another new machine. You only had one in November 2016. Good grief! They're throwing them away.
38 months apparently.
My last day, Rob sent me to collect my new device and said, hand it over. Apparently, if I hadn't collected it, it would have gone into the pool and the department would have been billed for it. Crazy. Anyway, so yeah, so I think it's a mixture of, you've got the startups that will go all cloud, and you've got those that are traditional on premises, and then you've got the Microsoft variables where everybody's got the right to do whatever they want to do. But how many people go into a building? I mean, do you go into the building? I shouldn't think you go into the building often, Marcus, do you know?
18. Well, I go to London occasionally. I haven't been to my office in Reading for 18 months, I don't think. Don't know if it might not even exist.
Wait, I shouldn't think it's key, isn't it? Because they were going to reopen buildings 1, 2, and 3 in end of March, I think. I don't know what's happening with that.
But since lockdown, it's been no different for most of us, really.
Yeah.
It's been business as usual, other than weekends.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, funnily enough, I was talking to Andrew Fryer about the same thing, because we were having this discussion about how hard is it for organizations to pivot to remote working, and we've not had too much difficulty, but that's because we had remote workers anyway. And I'm interested for us. I think hybrid join is probably the way to go, because I still have on-prem AD assets that I'm not going to be able to get rid of for a while.
Yeah.
But I like the simplicity of
define assets.
AD join. Andy's an assets, right?
I'm just meaning things like you've got the app proxy that means you can get into on-premises apps. You don't need the domain unless you're talking things that still need Kerberos and still need NTLM on premises. Then you do need those.
Yes, I have some of those. I'm afraid. For a little company, I have some scary enterprise crap littered around.
Yeah. No problem.
Asking you if you've done any development in Azure AD is probably not the right audience, really, is it?
Any development in Azure AD?
You'd be writing code.
Visual Basic 6, 1996, my last development.
Okay. I won't ask you Azure AD dev questions then. Ryan and I might be able to field Azure AD dev questions if anybody in the audience has any. Depends how hard they are.
I've had plenty this week, but I won't bother you with them.
You're all right, Marcus. You could just go hassle Alex Simons directly.
I don't think hassling a CVP is really a good career move, though, is it, really?
It depends on the CVP.
Oh, he's all right, but...
It depends if you don't know how to do something or you're convinced it's actually broken.
As Eldert will attest, we usually find that applying the CVP with gin first works wonders.
I have a question. Do you get many people, many of your customers Azure AD domain joining Linux environments? Is that something you see a lot?
You can't Azure AD